for joining me, everyone. Chuck Morse here, Left Right Radio, Monday through Friday, 12 noon generally, but this being internet, it could be any time. My guest is Bill Tatro. Bill is a longtime economic columnist. He's been on major network. His radio program is called It's All About Money, and Bill has a way of describing what seem on the surface to be complex economic issues in a way that's accessible and easy to understand. Bill, thanks for joining me.
Chuck, pleasure to be here after we've got all the snafus.
Well, there we go. This is the new media here. And, right. you could do a radio program anywhere, anytime. Bill, I want to talk a little bit about the current economic policy of the Trump administration, specifically the business of placing tariffs on imports of steel from China and other imports. Is tariffs a good policy? I mean, the stated reason for it is to protect American industry and labor. Does it do that? And if so, is that good? Or do you think a more free trade stance is preferable?
Well, what's interesting is that question has been asked to me a lot. And I've kind of stepped back and has been asked in a little bit different way. And like, can you understand what the Trump policy is, what the objective is? And I have sat for a little twisted with it. And then I had an individual who sent me an email and said, can you, because I do on my show, I do what's called Economics Learned. And I teach economics on my show. Mm-hmm. And the basics from 101 all the way up to mercantilism.
Right.
What does that mean? And then I started thinking and I said, you know something? Donald Trump is a 21st man whose economic policies are mired in the 16th and 18th centuries. He's a mercantilist. So what does that mean? And basically, I can answer your question with of mercantilism.
Sure.
Basically, back in those days, specifically in the 1700s, and many people will understand the navigation of Great Britain with their colonies. The whole idea of a mercantilist is that you made your country wealthier than, and how you did that was you got more bullion, gold coming into your country, putting aside conquering different lands. But how did coming into your country? It was through trade. Mm-hmm. And you sold more stuff or exporting. You got to bring gold into your country. And that's how you saw your wealth grow. Also meant, and I read a lot about this, that they believed that they were the winners. There were winners and losers. And I've read every one of Trump, whether he wrote them or not or ghosted, it was his philosophy. Donald Trump hated and hates being a loser. And we have a balance of trade deficit, not a surplus, but a significant deficit. And I got to believe up every morning and goes, that's losing. I'm make America great again. What does that mean? And so consequently, what he does and what they did back then is to try to get more exports as opposed to imports. Now, the question is a good thing. Well, when various economists and Ricardo, et cetera, came out and they go, look, it's not a game. Remember, if we send money to China, they send product to us. They build product. They send it. And it goes to Walmart. And so when people walk in, they go, hey, man, this is a cheap product. I'm buying it. They don't look at the tag. Go, and I don't know if it was Jimmy Carter or Ford or whoever said, buy America, buy America. People don't buy America. They buy cheap.
Right.
They buy bulk. They buy cheap. And so consequently, the big thing with mercantilists is they will always favor manufacturer, the producer, the corporation at the expense of the consumer. Mercantilism is always secondary. Now, here's a lot of people don't realize what happened. Remember when Trump talked about putting steel and aluminum? Well,
yes. Mm-hmm.
What I had a radio show host say to me, well, that's going to make, you can get China out of here. That's going to make steel cheaper, right? And
Sure.
I go, how do you figure that? And he goes, well, it's going to be made in America. What we saw happen, let's use this as an example, Chuck. Say that aluminum is being sold in the United States for, I don't care, ton, whatever it is, and this is just a number, folks, so at 105. But the Chinese are selling it at 100. So we're more expensive. So Trump comes in and says 25% tariff. So the Chinese go from 100 to 125. Oh, that's great. Instead of paying 125, we'll pay 105 American. We'll buy American. But the American doesn't do that. The American says, well, if the Chinese are paying 125, we'll run 105 up to 120.
Okay.
We'll make it more expensive, but we're still going to be under the Chinese. Now, what happened in the Midwest is that a lot of these grain bins and things that are refrigerated use a lot of aluminum. All of a sudden, guys who were about ready to buy these or had put orders saw their prices jump 35 to 40%. If they were going to use Chinese aluminum, it would have been even more. But the Americans bumped it up, and they took it up to a higher price. So who got screwed? The consumer. Once again,
right.
That's mercantilism. That's mercantilism.
Interesting. I mean, my impression about mercantilism, and you're quite right in your identification, is that it was a system that was mainly devised by the British Empire by which a corporation would have to be licensed by the crown and would have to be, it was sort of a shared business, that it would be like the East India Company or the New England Company, and that the profit would go to the government partially and then partially to the traders, and that it was not an open competition, that businesses were run by the government. They ran a triangle trade with the colonies, and they embargoed any foreign governments from trading with the colonies, which was one of the causes of the American Revolution. Right. And that the American Revolution basically freed up business to engage in free trade while at the same time having to register with states. And they put in the Constitution an article to allow for the Congress to regulate tariff and trade policy. So tariff is nothing new. It goes back to the very beginning. Every administration has weighed and measured tariffs, and they have weighed exactly as you say, Bill, quite accurately, the benefit of the consumer versus the benefit of domestic industry, domestic labor, domestic interests. And it's not an exact science. I mean, I think that policies like tariffs need to be and are calibrated from time to time to be commensurate not only to the economy, to protect American labor. I mean, American labor over the past century has gone through great effort to gain the level it's at in terms of working conditions and wages and benefits. And labor is a commodity like anything else, as are corporations doing business domestically in the United States. So the question is whether or not there can be a tariff with China where the trade balance is really out of whack. I mean, I'm not putting aside steel. I mean, the Chinese can make a sneaker for like $1.50 and then sell it in the United States for $100. I mean, the question that is before us now is whether or not China would be willing to accept a reasonable small tariff on imports to at least give some protection to domestic production and at the same time not raise the price. And I think that the answer to that, from what I understand, and it's all being negotiated now, is that they are going to absorb it because they're kind of blinking in a showdown with Trump, and that if Trump or whoever's the president doesn't do it now, then we're going to lose our leverage going forward because American industry is going to go under and going to leave the country, and in the name of doing getting virtual slave labor in places like China or Indonesia, and the American employee, the American laborer, is going to be screwed.
You're absolutely right, Chuck. It's a balance, and it always seems to be, if we go back to 1929, 1930, and actually when it was implemented it was 30. It was discussed in 29. That's Smoot-Hawley,
right? And
the whole idea of those, if you read in those days, the congressmen, the senators, it started out as tariffs on agriculture, and then every congressman and every senator discovered how it was like the most popular thing to get him votes. So all of a sudden we had tariffs on everything known to man. Well, one of the things that happened at those days, and this is what's fascinating, when I heard Munchin say several months ago, well, there's no way that the Chinese are going to, come against us. We're the United States. There's nothing. They're not going to come against us. They're not going to take an opposite position. They can't do that. Same thing was fought in 29 and 30 when these guys said, well, we may put tariffs on, but the other countries won't do that. And of course, what happened was everything came to a standstill, and everything. I mean, one could make the case. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons for the depression of the 30s, but one could make the case one of the most significant kickstarters was the Smoot-Hawley. Now here you have the other day, and I think it was Draghi. I think it was Mario Draghi who simply said, if you're going to, because we're now in competition with the talking tariffs on the European Union. If you're doing this, and maybe it was Macron, I'm not sure, but if you're doing this with your allies, you're supposedly your friends, and I mean, come on. So maybe it's the approach, but as my wife used to say, look, you get disappointed with Donald Trump. What do you expect? You knew the guy, you've known his history, you've known him for a long time. You know what he's going to do. He comes at you. He came at trade unionists. He comes at you and then takes a step back and says, okay, let's talk about it. And so he's taken that approach on the world stage. I'm coming at you hard. And then once I've done that and you see I'm serious, now then let's get down to have discussion. I think, as you said earlier, you're absolutely right. There has to be room, especially with the technological advancements and all these different things that are going on, and the technological theft that the Chinese will, they'll require. You have to give us your data, your information if you want to trade with us, et cetera. I think these things have to be not put to the side. They have to be discussed. But I'm not sure you do it like Teddy Roosevelt. Well, maybe you do it like Teddy Roosevelt, walk softly and carry a big stick as opposed to using the stick first. So I think there has to be room for that. But, again, I wrote a piece yesterday in my Economics Learned that for Donald Trump, a lot of this, I believe, is ego. And I think that he's had such success through the years with that particular style that it's very difficult for him to have any other style. I mean,
well, he's had a very consistent philosophy, I think, going way back, particularly in the area of trade and protectionism. I mean, and I think you've characterized his style of negotiating quite right. If you read The Art of the Deal, which I read years ago, and it was very interesting, he does come at it heavy and hard, and then there's a negotiation, and eventually it's like, it kind of reminds me, I mean, I'm in Boston, like Mayor Kevin White back in the old days. He would release a press release on a late Friday afternoon. I'm going to raise taxes 50%. And everybody would be all upset. And then he'd wait 3 weeks and he'd raise taxes 25%. And he'd say, you see, I saved you 25%. It's kind of like right? It's a tactic. As far as Smoot-Hawley goes, I've seen articles by economists on both sides of that. Some say that has been greatly exaggerated in terms of its effect on the depression. And, I don't know. I mean, I'm not that well versed in things to comment. Well, you know better. But I just want to also point out that, there's a lot of talk about, Trump triggering a trade war. And I think that the truth is that we're already in a trade war. Germany in particular, but the European Union and China and perhaps other countries, they're already having their own tariff system. I mean, they don't, to get American import into Japan, for example, it's very expensive. So they're already putting up trade barriers as it is. And I think that what we're seeing now, and presidents in the past have talked about this, going back, I think, to at least Bill Clinton, if not Jimmy Carter, that we need to respond in kind and protect American industry, or at least bring things up to a certain parity in terms of trading with equal footing. It's not so much that we're causing the trade war. We're in a trade war. We're entering the field of battle now, and we're saying, look, we still have the preeminent economy in the world, and we're going to use our leverage to protect American industry and labor without seeing you guys jack up the price and hurt American consumers.
The problem, if I can say, and I agree with you on that, can't have too much agreement here because all of a sudden it becomes a dull show. Right. But one of the things is that back in 29 or in 30, you didn't have the same kind of moving parts that you've got today. And what do I mean by that is you didn't have the same kind of technology. I mean, we are right now. One of the things is that in the steel industry, we are producing something like 20% domestically. We're producing something like 20% more steel with approximately 20% less workers. So the efficiency, even though our steel mills are way behind the Chinese, but then you add on top of that our propensity for the minimum wage, and you start to look at the which wasn't back in 29. I mean, like it is today. So now all of a sudden your care is for the American worker. I remember when Adam Smith kind of put a knife into mercantilism, back to that. Mm-hmm. But Adam Smith believed that government had a role in the economy. Yes, he was a hands-off, but he still had a belief that there was a degree of responsibility to the government, specifically to workers. Now, one of the problems now is that, I was in the first McDonald's that was totally automated. This is just maybe 9 months ago. And I walked in and I asked the guy who was the manager, and I go, all these kiosks and all the things. And I said, how many people used to work here? And the guy says, well, we had 28. How many work here now? He says 2. And he said, and it will be 1 because it's either going to be me or the other guy who does the best job here. All right. So the question becomes, what do you do with those 27 workers? And so automation is now part of it. And so when you throw that into the mix and you say, look, and you'll hear Donald Trump say this all the time, and all the politicians, we want to bring jobs back to America. We want to make sure that it's there's certain jobs that are not going to come back to America. But there's going to be situations around the world where they're doing it cheaper. Yes. The question also, Chuck, becomes, will the American public walk into a store and that which they might have been paying $10 for, they're now going to be paying $15 for? Why? Because we brought it back to America. And so that becomes an issue, a very significant.
Well, that's right.
As I said, that gets a lot of moving parts.
Well, that gets to what we talked about, which is, can there be a modest tariff to bring about more of a trade balance and to protect industry without the foreign import moving the price up? That's the negotiation, and that's a question that remains to be seen. My understanding is that so far, China is agreeing not to do this. We'll see. But as far as the automation goes, that's economic development. I mean, that's happening all over the world. Pretty soon we'll have automated cars. It's going to put like Uber out of business. I mean, you'll have them, they're experimenting with cars that carry people, and I'm sure there'll be financial incentives eventually, if that happens, for people to get their car off the road. This is the future. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's not going to be work for people. I think that with the human imagination and with creativity and with investment, who knows what's going to be invented in the future. But I do think that the day of the big factory where you have 5,000 people punching a clock, that's over. That was the 1930s. That was the height of that in the time of FDR. I think that now we're moving more toward a new economy, which is almost reflective of the original economy of the founders, the agrarian economy, where you have people like you and I, for example, who are working from our kitchen tables. We have the computer allows you to work 24 hours a day, can wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and do some work. It's in other words, we're having people who are more homegrown, more local, doing work locally and maybe communicating around the country and even globally. But nevertheless, there are smaller enterprises where people are doing work in a virtual world, in the case of the internet, and in other ways. And I think that it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be less employment. It just means there's going to be a shift toward individual employment, more local employment. I'm very much into the localism movement, and it's something that I think will resolve itself as the economy develops, because every generation people are upset about changes in how we function, how we do things. I mean, the industrial age put a lot of people into a whole new world, and it was not necessarily easy for a period of time. I mean, the invention of the car put the horse and buggy industry out of business. Here in Massachusetts, there were whole communities that went into a depression. Some of them never recovered. And there was calls, by the way, for horse and buggy manufacturers for the state to come in and subsidize them because, they lost their income overnight practically. So I just think that those are natural dislocations in any society economically.
Oh, I absolutely agree. If you look back, when we went from an agrarian society to a manufacturing society, it doesn't happen overnight. And manufacturing into information, we go from information, and it's this continual shift. But a lot of people want it to happen overnight. Oh, yeah, okay, so we move everybody off the farm and we move them into the factory. We move everybody from the factory and we move them into the information. We move from information to whatever is next. But it doesn't happen that way, and there's this shift. And sometimes there's several years before the country or the economy finds its way. And that's a big thing because, there will be people lost. And in that shift, there will be people lost. And it's just the way of the economy. It's the way it is.
That's right. And I think that the trend, as I've said, and it doesn't happen overnight, it happens over a generation, not only is a move toward more localism economically, but it's also, the days of the huge, big government programs, I think, is also over. The last gasp of that, I think, was Obamacare. And I just think that people don't want to have the federal government there deciding who their doctor is going to be and, whether or not they're going to, live and die and, what kind of treatment they're going to get. There's more of a move toward look back to the local doctor, the local practitioner, the local, license. And I think that's something that's happening both economically and politically. It's a rejection of the big, nanny state and the big corporate state. And I think that that's an economic trend that's showing itself more and more as time goes on.
I think you're right. And one never knows how that, if you look historic, we've been talking about, mercantilism. You go back to the 16th, the 17th, the 18th centuries, transitions sometimes are not always peaceful. Right. And transitions from one type of society, one type of working, governing, sometimes are not always peaceful. And you see that right now happening around the world. And you see in America, South America, different, just in the last week in different countries down there, people taking to the streets. And so, don't think America will be, let's say, sheltered from that, because we're starting to see more and more people taking to the streets now with their placards and their signs and things like that. But again, change is, a lot of people don't like it, but change is inevitable. And technological advancement is inevitable. And when some people get left behind, they get angry. When they get angry, strange things happen. But it is what it is. You can't stop it. Somebody said, now, I'm one of the biggest haters of cell phones, and yet I'm one of the biggest users of a cell phone.
Right.
I found that people have made cell phones their family, their friends, their God, everything. I watched four young ladies. I watched four young ladies walk down a beach, never look up to sunset in Hawaii that I've ever seen, and they never looked.
Oh, I know what you mean.
And,
it's crazy.
It's unbelievable. And so, technology is great. It can be used to extremes. It can be used negatively, and it always has been. It's nothing new. This is not anything new. And again, if I circle back, if I had to say who Donald Trump was and the original question about his economic policies, it's mercantilism, and we'll see how it plays out. It's mixed with his ego, and we'll see if the American, who usually, or the consumer usually comes up on the short end of mercantilism, how the consumer reacts under this particular. In our country, we react by, kind of going to the ballot box. That's how we react, and hopefully we'll continue to react that way in the future, as opposed to going up the hill.
Well, the area where I differ with you on this is that I don't think that his economic theories are mercantilism, regardless of his own ego. And all these guys are egomaniacs anyways. But it has more to, I think he's embraced what's been called the American system, that was first employed by Alexander Hamilton, who was the father of the tariff and who really was the father of a strong federal government with, interstate entities and the development of a pretty vigorous government, but yet at the same time one that would be in place to advance commerce. You could hardly call him a socialist. And that system advanced with the American system of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln and the early Republican Party. And it's really a system that does have, it is protectionist. It does want to have strong national infrastructure. It's very pro-business, pro-investment, and very kind of localist. And I think that is much more the description of Trump. I mean, he's not, he's getting away from the Wilsonian internationalism that's been in place since the early 20th century, which holds up global trade and globalism as the great, goal. And he wants essentially the reinvigoration of the sovereign nation state. And he's encouraged other nations to do the same thing. It's not isolationism. I thought his comments were very interesting at, for example, the Davos conference, where people were saying, oh, how can Trump go there? He's a boob, he's going to embarrass the country. But he goes there and his message was, I want to put America first as a sovereign nation and our interests first. And I would suggest that you put your respective nations also first. And we'll then have what's called the Concert of Nations. And people, they responded to that. People were like looking at that and going, okay, this is not, in a way, it's, I would argue it's very progressive because it's democratic and it essentially reestablishes political entities that reflect the values of the people who live there. And I think that the American system of Hamilton and of Lincoln, that is much more what we're seeing now, not mercantilism. Mercantilism, I think, was rejected by the American Revolution. The state doesn't come in and charter industries and then run them and, take half the profits. We let industry be industry, but at the same time, the government can put in certain goalposts. It's like a football game. You let the companies do what they do, but you put in certain rules as goalposts. Then you say, go ahead and go at it. But so that's how I see it.
I think we can agree to disagree. The fact that I think you're absolutely right. But again, I'll still use that term for him, mercantilist.
Okay.
And it's evolved. And, as an economist, I read somebody that said no legitimate economist today would ever embrace the term mercantilist. And so, I'm almost saying that, you're right, yes, but there's that vestige of mercantilism in there, and so I'll stand by that.
Fair enough.
Chuck.
Fair enough. And so, Bill, what are you working on now over there? Because I know you do a weekly show. What is your show like? How do people watch you?
What is my what?
How is your, you host a podcast? How can people talk about that a little bit? How can people see you or hear you on the internet, or how do you do it?
Well, what they do is they go to Bill Tatro, that's T-A-T, T as in Tom, A-T as in Tom, R-O, BillTatro.com. And if they go /radio, then they'll get a lot more information. I do a lot of written. I do, and I was on the radio for many, many years in Phoenix. I was had a syndicated radio show years ago, back in the 90s in the whole Northeast. Actually, I was in Boston. I was in Chicago, called It's All About Money. And then 9/11 happened, and I lost 3 friends at Cantor Fitzgerald. Kind of went underground for a couple of years, came out with a self-help book, and then was out in Arizona, went on the air there for several years, 5 days a week, 2 o'clock, and then retired a few years ago, and then came back onto the internet and have a podcast, BillTatro.com, subscription membership. It's like a cup of coffee once a month, which covers a few costs here and there. But then we give, if they go to BillTatro.com/radio, they get it for almost for free. And that comes out 3-4 times a week. And then the final thing is, have just completed a play. It's now in New York with a few producers, and it's called The Millennial in the Basement. Which I'm very excited about. I had a book 3 years ago, which is called 44th, The Presidential Conspiracy. So I like to do a lot of writing in my retired time and work on the internet and kind of just, continue doing the things that I've done for a long time and here once in a while on a show like yours and really enjoy it. Really enjoy it.
Great. I mean, you're a little bit like me in the, sort of former radio talk show host, also an author. I have a new book out. They'll be coming out called Assassinations in America. So it's kind of similar genre there. And, and I also do this program. Anyways, Bill, listen, it's great meeting you, and I really appreciate you joining me this afternoon.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Chuck, and hopefully we can do it again sometime soon.
Definitely. All right. Take care. Okay, so thanks for watching, everybody. I shall return the usual time tomorrow noon. You're watching and listening to Left Right Radio with Chuck Morse. Have a good day, everybody.